March 6, 1942. 4:27 in the morning, North Atlantic. The ocean was black. Not the comfortable darkness of a moonless night on land, but the kind of black that erases the horizon, that turns water and sky into a single void. Chief Torpedoman Mate Silas Merrick stood on the bridge wing of the USS Benson, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching convoy HX-229 grind westward through heavy swells. 23 merchant ships, each one carrying food, fuel, medicine, steel, each one riding low under cargo that Britain needed to survive. Each one a target. Merrick had seen this before. 12 years in the Navy gave a man certain instincts. The way his stomach would tighten when sonar pings changed rhythm. The way the Atlantic itself seemed to hold its breath before the killing started. Then he saw it. A wake. Thin, straight, moving fast, angling toward the SS Nariva from her port quarter. The wake passed directly underneath the Nariva's hull. Merrick blinked hard, wiped salt spray from his eyes. The wake continued on the far side of the merchant ship, fading into darkness. No explosion, no impact, just a torpedo that had run underneath its target. Then the second wake appeared. This one struck true. The Nariva's midships erupted in flame that turned night into noon. Steel screamed as the hull folded inward. The ship broke in half. Not slowly, it just broke. Men were falling into water that would kill them with cold in 7 minutes. Merrick kept his binoculars locked on the sinking ship. His job was to observe, to record, but his mind was counting. 2 torpedoes, same bearing, same target, one passed underneath, one hit. The Nariva vanished in less than 3 minutes. Merrick pulled out his logbook and wrote, 0427 hours, SS Nariva torpedoed, 2 weapons observed. First torpedo passed beneath target, no detonation. Second torpedo struck amidships, fatal hit. He underlined one sentence, first torpedo passed beneath target. Lieutenant Commander Hayes appeared at his shoulder. Chief, did you get a bearing on that U-boat? No, sir, but I saw something else. First torpedo ran underneath the target. Clean miss. Second one hit. Hayes frowned. Dark out there, Chief. Rough seas. You probably saw the wake from the second torpedo and thought you saw 2. Sir, I've watched 400 torpedoes fired in 12 years. I know what I saw. You think you know what you saw. The mind plays tricks. Merrick said nothing. You didn't argue with officers. But he didn't cross out what he'd written, because Silas Merrick trusted his eyes more than anyone's explanation for why those eyes must be wrong. Merrick had joined the Navy in 1930. 20 years old, fresh from Bethlehem Steel, where he'd worked alongside his father. The Depression had hit the Lehigh Valley hard. His father had looked at him one morning and said 6 words, "Navy needs machinists. You should go." Merrick had taken to torpedoes the way some men took to music. There was a logic to them, a mechanical honesty. You set the gyro, calculated the depth, maintained the air flask pressure, and the weapon did what physics demanded. He'd made Chief Torpedoman Mate at 28, youngest in his class. The promotion had come with a reputation. Merrick could hear when a gyro bearing was 0.2 degrees off spec, could feel through his hands when a depth engine valve needed adjustment. But what made Merrick valuable was that he trusted what his hands told him more than what paperwork said should be true. 3,000 miles away, on the Baltic coast of Germany, the ocean was behaving itself. The test facility at Eckernförde sat on protected water where conditions were calm, controlled, predictable. Inside, Dr. Heinrich Vogel stood before a test tank 50 meters long, watching his creation perform exactly as designed. The G7E torpedo hung suspended in crystal-clear water, every rivet flush, every seal perfect, by any measure a flawless object. Vogel was 54, 32 years studying hydrodynamics, pressure curves, magnetic field theory. When the Kriegsmarine needed someone to design the weapon that would strangle Britain, they had come to him, and he had delivered. The torpedo incorporated 2 innovations that made it, in Vogel's opinion, the most advanced underwater weapon in the world. First, the depth control mechanism, a pressure-sensing diaphragm connected to pneumatic servos that maintained depth to within 0.3 meters. Other nations used simple pendulum systems that drifted by 2 or 3 meters. Vogel's torpedo stayed exactly where you told it to stay. Second, the magnetic influence pistol. Instead of requiring direct contact, the weapon would detect the magnetic field generated by thousands of tons of steel and detonate underneath the ship, breaking its keel. In the test tank, it worked flawlessly. Vogel gestured to his assistant, a young engineer named Oscar Brennice. Commence firing sequence. The torpedo slid forward, electric motor humming. Down the tank it ran. Vogel watched the depth gauge. 4.1 meters. 4.0. 3.9. Perfect. At the far end, the magnetic pistol sensed the steel target and triggered exactly as designed. Vogel turned to the assembled officers. Admiral Dönitz stood in the back row, watching. "Gentlemen, you have witnessed the 247th consecutive successful test. We have removed chaos from naval warfare. The torpedo you see does not guess, it calculates.
And calculation does not fail."
What Vogel didn't say was that the test tank was maintained at 15 degrees Celsius, that the water was filtered daily, that the salinity matched the Baltic in summer, that the magnetic target was positioned at exactly 52 degrees north latitude. Because those details were irrelevant, physics was physics. A pressure curve calculated in a laboratory would behave the same way in the open ocean. Had to. Brennice appeared after the demonstration, carrying a thin folder. "Herr Doctor, the field reports from last month." Vogel didn't open it. "Summary?" 17 U-boat commanders reported anomalous behavior. 8 described weapons running deeper than set. 4 reported premature detonations. 5 reported weapons passing beneath targets. And the water temperatures? Below 6 degrees Celsius in most cases. Vogel opened the folder. A commander named Hartmann from U-156 had written a detailed analysis suggesting cold water might be affecting the pressure sensor. The report included temperature measurements, depth calculations, even sketches. It was thorough, well-reasoned. Wrong. How many torpedoes have these commanders fired total? Approximately 230, Herr Doctor. Successful attacks? 71 confirmed sinkings. 31%. That was low. But it could be explained by poor firing solutions, target evasion, early detection, not by a fundamental flaw in the weapon itself. "These commanders are operating under extreme stress," Vogel said. "In darkness, in rough seas, they are attempting to rationalize their failures by blaming the one element that has been scientifically validated. But, Herr Doctor, if we were to test in colder water, we have tested across the appropriate temperature range. The physics does not change because a U-boat commander wishes it to. File these reports. Note that operational procedures are under review. And Oscar, do not bring me theories from the field that contradict validated laboratory data." Brennice took the folder and left. Vogel stood alone, watching technicians prepare the torpedo for its 248th perfect run. Outside, the Baltic Sea lay calm and grey and exactly 15 degrees Celsius. He had no reason to doubt his work. Korvettenkapitän Ernst Hartmann stood in U-156's conning tower, 300 nautical miles north of the Azores, watching a British freighter chug along at 8 knots. March 18th. Calm seas, good visibility, a straight-running target making no evasive maneuvers. Perfect conditions. Hartmann had been hunting for 4 years, 8 patrols, 43 ships sunk. He knew when certainty crystallized and you gave the order that would erase a ship from existence. This should have been simple. Range? 800 meters, Herr Kalun. Bearing steady. Angle on the bow? Port 90. Perfect firing solution. By the book. Tube 1, fire. Tube 2, fire. Tube 3, fire. Tube 4, fire. U-156 shuddered as compressed air launched 4 G7E torpedoes, each one costing more than Hartmann would earn in 5 years. He raised his binoculars and started counting. The first torpedo's wake was clearly visible, arrowing toward the freighter. Hartman watched it reach the hull, watched it pass underneath without detonating. The second torpedo exploded 50 meters short. A column of water erupted, but the freighter sailed through without slowing. The third torpedo left no wake, ran deep, ran invisible, ran useless. The fourth struck the stern at a shallow angle, tore a hole, but didn't penetrate deep enough to cause catastrophic damage. The ship began listing, but remained afloat. 4 torpedoes at a stationary target in perfect conditions. 1 glancing hit. Water temperature? Hartman asked quietly. 4 degrees Celsius, Herr Kalun. 4 degrees. The Baltic, where these torpedoes had been tested, ran closer to 15. Hartman had written 3 previous reports about this pattern. Each time, the response had been identical. Maintain proper firing procedures, weapon performance validated, operator error, most likely cause. He looked at his executive officer. Log it as malfunction, all 4. The freighter limped away. Somewhere in Germany, Dr. Vogel was probably conducting another flawless test in a tank that bore no resemblance to the North Atlantic in March. Hartman went below to write another report that someone would file and forget. Aboard the USS Benson, Merrick filled his logbook with observations nobody wanted. March 6th, SS Nariva, 2 torpedoes, 1 passed beneath. March 9th, SS Cordelia, 3 torpedoes, 2 deep wakes, 1 hit. March 12th, SS Bretagne, wake passed under stern. 23 convoy actions, 14 torpedoes that appeared to pass underneath targets, 6 premature explosions, only 3 clean kills. Merrick plotted the attacks on a hand-drawn chart, used different colors for hits versus misses, drew circles around water temperatures. A pattern emerged. Warmer waters south of 40 degrees. German torpedoes worked. High success rate. Colder waters north of 50 degrees. German torpedoes failed. Frequently. Consistently. On April 12th, Merrick requested a meeting with Commander Atticus Whitfield, the squadron leader. Sir, I've been tracking German torpedo attacks since March. Their torpedoes are failing more in cold water. I've documented 23 attacks. Whitfield studied the chart for 15 seconds. Chief, German torpedoes are the most advanced in the world. If there was a systematic flaw, their engineers would have found it. Sir, I've worked torpedoes for 12 years. These weapons are running 3, maybe 4 meters deeper than set. Whitfield closed the logbook. You're seeing patterns because you want to. It's dark. Seas are rough. You're watching from hundreds of yards away through binoculars at night. Sir, I know the difference between... Chief, I appreciate your diligence, but you're asking me to believe that German engineers, who've been perfecting this for 20 years, somehow missed a fundamental flaw that you spotted by watching distant explosions in the dark. The more likely explanation is that stress and fatigue are affecting your observations. Merrick said nothing. Get some rest. That's an order. Back in quarters, Merrick opened his logbook to a fresh page and wrote, "Water temperature matters. Nobody believes me yet." He underlined the word yet. 2 days later, transfer orders arrived. Naval Torpedo Station, Newport, Rhode Island. Report, April 15th. He packed his logbook first. April 15th, 1942, Newport, Rhode Island. The Naval Torpedo Station sat on Goat Island, where the water stayed cold even in summer. Low brick buildings, testing rigs extending over the water, workshops where lathes ran, and men understood that precision meant the difference between life and death. Lieutenant Commander Thaddeus Kincaid met him in an office overlooking the test basin. 45, weathered face, Annapolis class of 1919. Kincaid stood when Merrick entered. That was unusual. "Chief Merrick, I'm told you can hear when a gyro bearing is 0.2 degrees out of spec." "0.3, sir. 0.2 I have to feel with my hands." Kincaid smiled. Real, not polite. "I've got a project requiring someone who trusts his hands more than paperwork." He led Merrick to a sealed workshop. Inside, mounted on a test stand, sat a German G7E torpedo. Beautiful. Not aesthetically, but the way a perfectly made tool is beautiful. Every line purposeful, every surface finished to tolerances that spoke of absolute confidence. Captured from U-570 last September, Kincaid said. The depth control is remarkable. Pressure sensor connected to pneumatic servos. Maintains depth to within 0.3 meters. Merrick circled slowly. And the magnetic pistol? Revolutionary. Detects the target's field, detonates underneath, breaks the keel. In theory. Kincaid looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Merrick pulled his logbook. Charts, observations, water temperatures. Sir, I documented every German attack I witnessed. 23 actions. Their torpedoes fail more in cold water. The failures cluster in northern latitudes. Kincaid read slowly. This wasn't an officer dismissing enlisted observations. This was an engineer recognizing a pattern. Your previous commander know about this? Yes, sir. He thought I was seeing things. And you weren't? Sir, I've watched 400 torpedoes fired. I know what depth control failure looks like. Kincaid looked at the torpedo, back at Merrick. Chief, your official assignment is to help us understand this weapon. Your unofficial assignment is to figure out why it doesn't work. You have full access. Use whatever you need. Sir, if I'm right, I'll be contradicting the best engineers in Germany. That means contradicting our own experts. You comfortable with that? Sir, I'm comfortable trusting what I can measure over what someone says I should believe. Merrick spent 8 days studying the G7E. He didn't just look, he measured, calculated, tested every component. The depth control was extraordinary. Set it for 4 meters. In the test tank, it would hold within a hand's width for the entire run. The magnetic pistol was equally impressive, detecting field variations, triggering at predetermined thresholds. On paper, both systems were flawless. Merrick didn't trust paper. On April 22nd, he requested test tank temperature data. 15 degrees Celsius, constant. He pulled North Atlantic convoy reports. Water temperatures, 3 to 6 degrees, variable, layered. That night, Merrick couldn't sleep. He kept circling back to one question. What happens to water pressure when temperature drops? He knew the answer. Cold water is denser. Denser water creates higher pressure at the same depth. A sensor calibrated for warm water would read high in cold water. Would think it was deeper than it was. Would tell the torpedo to rise when it should dive. At 11:40, Merrick got up and walked to the test facility. The guard waved him through. Nobody questioned a chief working extra hours. Inside, empty. Quiet except for water pumps. Merrick made a decision that could end his career. The facility had 3 tanks. The main tank, heated to 15 degrees, and 2 auxiliary tanks, unheated, filled with raw seawater pumped from Narragansett Bay. Merrick went to the pump room, opened the valves, let the auxiliary tanks fill with unfiltered seawater. Temperature, 5 degrees Celsius. He rolled the G7E to the first auxiliary tank. 1,500 pounds of weapon. Set the depth control for 4 meters. Activated the motor. Lowered it into raw seawater. It ran. Merrick watched the depth gauge. 4.1, 4.4, 5.2, 6.1. The torpedo thought it was holding 4 meters, but the actual depth kept increasing because cold water was denser, creating higher pressure, fooling the sensor. At 7.3 meters, the torpedo reached the end. Merrick's hands were shaking, not from cold, from understanding that thousands had died because nobody had tested the weapon in actual conditions. He drained the tank, filled it with heated water, 15 degrees, ran the torpedo again, 4.2, 4.1, 3.9, 4.0. Perfect. Merrick sat on the concrete floor at 1:17 in the morning and laughed. Not happy, understanding that men had died because nobody thought to test assumptions. At 2:15, he called Kincaid. Sir, you need to come to the test facility, right now. Merrick, it's 02:15. Sir, I know what's wrong with the German torpedo, and it's worse than we thought. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Kincaid arrived in 8, still buttoning his jacket. Merrick had the torpedo ready. Tank filled with cold seawater, 4 degrees. Show me. Merrick set depth control to 4 meters, lowered it. They watched it run deep, past 6 meters, past 7.
Jesus Christ, Kincaid said quietly.
Merrick retrieved it, drained the tank, warm water, ran it again. Perfect 4 meters. Kincaid stood very still. The Germans tested this in the Baltic. Yes, sir, 15 degrees, same as here. But the North Atlantic in winter, 3 to 6 degrees, sir, dense, different pressure curve. Kincaid started calculating. How deep would a torpedo set for 4 meters actually run? 7 meters, sir, maybe 8 in the coldest zones.
And merchant ship drafts?
6 to 7 meters fully loaded, sir. Kincaid looked up. So a torpedo set to run underneath and break the keel passes clean underneath, sir, doesn't touch it. Silence. How many ships survived because of this? Don't know, sir, but I documented 14 that passed under in just the actions I witnessed. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of lives. Kincaid checked his watch. Chief, run this test again. Document everything. I need data so solid, nobody can question it. Yes, sir. And Merrick, you just disobeyed 6 regulations by running unauthorized tests on classified equipment in the middle of the night. Don't do it again. Next time, wake me up first. Merrick ran the test 17 more times before dawn. Built data that was undeniable. When the sun came up, Merrick had proven that German torpedo technology was perfect for a war that didn't exist. April 28th, 8:03. Doctor. Phineas Aldridge arrived in a worn 1938 Ford. 56, grey-haired, suit that didn't fit. MIT professor. Hydrodynamics and electromagnetic theory. Kincaid had called him 3 days earlier. They met in the workshop. Merrick demonstrated the temperature tests. Aldridge watched in silence, making notes filled with elegant equations. After the 4th demonstration, Aldridge set down his journal. How did the Germans miss this? Merrick looked at Kincaid, who nodded.
Sir, they tested in conditions they could control. We tested in conditions we couldn't.
Aldridge smiled, spoken like someone who understands the difference between laboratory and reality. The chief's analysis is correct. Cold water creates denser medium, higher pressure at equivalent depth. A sensor, calibrated for 15-degree water, will misread by 2 to 3 meters in Atlantic winter. Can we fix it? Kincaid asked. Compensate for it, yes. Adjust depth setting down 3 meters. Set for 1 meter, it'll run at 4 in cold water. Crude, but effective. Aldridge walked to the magnetic pistol. What about this? Haven't tested it yet, sir. Then let's test it now. 6 hours of experiments. Magnetic field sensors, charts showing Earth's field strength at different latitudes. What they discovered was worse. The magnetic pistol worked by detecting field strength changes. In the test tank at 41 degrees north, baseline was 0.48 Gauss. Aldridge simulated higher latitudes, 55 degrees north, North Atlantic convoy routes. The pistol triggered 40 meters early. It's sensing Earth's magnetic field variation, Aldridge explained. As you move north, the planet's field gets stronger. The pistol can't distinguish between background increase and a ship's hull. Triggers prematurely. How far off? Kincaid asked. At northern latitudes, 50 to 60 meters early. Explodes before reaching target.
Merrick felt cold settle in his stomach.
And southern latitudes? Weaker field, might not trigger at all. Passed directly underneath without detonating. 3 men stood looking at a weapon designed by brilliant engineers, tested extensively, validated mathematically, and it was wrong in 2 fundamental ways. Do our torpedoes have the same problem? Merrick and Aldridge looked at each other. Sir, the Mark 14 uses magnetic influence exploder, similar design. Show me. They brought out a Mark 14, ran the same tests, different temperature water, different magnetic latitudes, same failures. How long have we been using these? Kincaid asked quietly. Since 1941, sir. And how many premature detonation reports? 47, sir. Logged as operator error or defective units. Kincaid sat heavily. We copied their mistake. We copied their innovation, sir, Aldridge corrected. The mistake was assuming laboratory-matched combat.
Both navies made that error.
But we can fix ours, Merrick said. How? Turn them off, sir. The magnetic exploders. Use contact detonators instead. Simple, reliable. That's remarkably inelegant, Aldridge said. Sir, elegant don't matter if it don't work. I'll take crude that hits over perfect that misses. Kincaid paced. If we do this, we're admitting years of development were flawed. We're throwing away sophisticated technology. Yes, sir. Bureau of Ordnance will fight this.
Yes, sir. We need more data, real ocean conditions.
Merrick had been waiting. Sir, give me a boat, give me a crew, 2 weeks. I'll get you data they can't ignore. May 5th, 0600, 8 miles off Block Island. The test boat was a converted sub-chaser. Crew of 6 plus 1 skeptical officer from Bureau of Ordnance. Lieutenant Beauregard Haynes was 38, Annapolis 28, and he did not believe a chief had discovered what engineers had missed.
Chief Merrick, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes, sir. That's why we're here. Water temperature, 6 degrees. North Atlantic conditions. They loaded a Mark 14, set it for 4-meter depth using standard calculation, fired at a target hulk 500 yards away. The torpedo ran at 7.2 meters, passed underneath. Haynes watched through binoculars, said nothing. Another torpedo. This time Merrick's adjusted calculation, set for 1 meter.
It struck the target dead center. Again, same result.
By day's end, 18 torpedoes fired. Standard settings, 11 hits. Merrick's settings, 23 hits. Haynes stopped objecting and started taking notes. Day 3, magnetic exploders. Iron targets at various distances. Simulated magnetic fields. 40 degrees north, perfect. 55 degrees north, premature. 53 meters early. 20 degrees north, failed to detonate. By May 18th, 37 torpedoes fired.
The data was undeniable.
Standard settings, 29.7% success. Merrick's settings, magnetic disabled, 62.2%. They returned May 19th. Haynes went to write his report. Merrick found Kincaid. Well, sir, we can double effectiveness by admitting our fancy technology doesn't work and going back to simple contact detonators. And Bureau of Ordnance will approve because
Lieutenant Haynes spent 2 weeks watching every magnetic exploder either miss or detonate early.
3 days later, Kincaid called Merrick to his office. Aldridge was there, Haynes too. Gentlemen, I've received authorization from Bureau of Ordnance. Effective immediately. All magnetic exploders disabled in Atlantic Theater. Depth settings adjusted using Chief Merrick's formula. Contact detonators reactivated. He looked at Merrick. They're also creating new protocol.
All weapons tested in operational conditions,
Not laboratory. Real ocean. Real temperatures. Real magnetic environments. The protocol is being named the Merrick Standard. Merrick said nothing. Haynes stood, extended his hand. Chief, I came here thinking you were wrong. I'm glad you weren't. When they were alone, Kincaid handed Merrick a folder. Deployment orders. You'll train crews on new procedures. New London, Pearl Harbor, Brisbane. Sir, I'm just a torpedoman.
You're the torpedoman who proved simple and reliable beats complex and broken.
Our crews need to hear that from the man who discovered it. Merrick took the folder. 6 months away, training crews. Teaching men that sometimes you threw away sophistication to achieve effectiveness. He thought about German engineers in perfect test tanks, about Vogel and his 247 perfect runs in water that bore no resemblance to March Atlantic,
about how confidence could become a blindfold.
Sir, one question. The Germans. Will they figure this out? Kincaid looked out at Narragansett Bay, where the water was cold and real. Eventually. But by then, we'll have fixed ours, and they'll still be wondering why their perfect technology keeps failing. Seems unfair, sir. War isn't fair, Chief. It's just real.
Merrick left with his orders and logbook, and knowledge that men would live, because he'd refused to believe perfect on paper meant perfect in practice. There were submarines waiting, and they needed to learn that sometimes the best weapon isn't the most sophisticated one, it's the one that works. July 15, 1942, 4:17 in the morning, North Atlantic, convoy ONS 113. The USS Benson was back on convoy duty. Different ships, same ocean, same darkness. But something had changed in 3 months since Merrick left for Newport. The destroyer's torpedo room now carried weapons configured exactly as Merrick specified. Magnetic exploders, disabled. Contact detonators, activated. Depth settings, adjusted down 3 meters. Simple, crude, effective. The Benson's new torpedo officer was Lieutenant J.G. Cordell, 24, fresh from training. He'd heard stories about Chief Merrick, the enlisted man who'd proven the engineers wrong. At 4:21, sonar picked up a contact. Submerged, moving fast. Surface contact bearing 097, range 3,000 yards, making turns for 12 knots. The captain didn't hesitate. All ahead full. Weapons, prepare for depth charge attack. But before the Benson could accelerate, the U-boat fired. 3,000 yards away, Korvettenkapitan Ernst Hartmann stood in U-156's conning tower, his 9th patrol. His frustration had calcified into something harder. Betrayal. 16 weeks earlier, he'd filed another detailed report about torpedo failures. The response had been identical. Maintain firing discipline, weapon performance validated, operator error primary cause. So Hartmann had stopped filing reports. He'd simply learned to expect failure. Target is lead merchant, port column, his XO said. Range 2,800 meters, speed 8 knots, perfect firing solution. Perfect on paper, Hartmann thought. Useless in reality. Water temperature? 5 degrees Celsius, Herr Kaljun. Of course. The North Atlantic in July was still cold enough to fool every sensor calibrated in the warm Baltic. Fire tubes 1 through 6, full spread. The U-boat shuddered 6 times, 6 torpedoes, each costing more than a Hamburg house, each certified by engineers who'd never felt Atlantic cold seep through a pressure hull. Hartmann watched through the periscope. Torpedo 1. Wake visible, running deep, passing underneath without contact. Torpedo 2. Premature detonation, 60 meters short. Magnetic pistol sensed something. Earth's field variation, ghost signal, anything except the actual target. Torpedo 3. Wake disappeared. Too deep to see. Too deep to matter. Torpedo 4. Struck the stern at shallow angle. Tore metal. Didn't penetrate deep enough for catastrophic flooding. The ship listed but continued. Torpedo 5. Another deep runner. Invisible. Useless. Torpedo 6. Exploded 50 meters early. Another confused magnetic pistol. 6 torpedoes. 1 damaged ship that wasn't even sinking. His XO stood silent. The crew had learned not to question why their weapons failed. They just accepted it like rough seas or cold rations or the knowledge that you might die because someone in a laboratory had been wrong. Herr Kalin, destroyer closing, range 2,200 meters, high speed. Hartmann lowered the periscope. Take us deep. Rig for depth charges. U-156 dove, the familiar routine of trying to survive what came next. The Benson's sonar tracked the U-boat to 200 feet. The captain maneuvered into attack position. Standard doctrine, pass over, drop depth charges. But Lieutenant Cordell had a different idea. Captain, request permission to use torpedoes instead of depth charges. The captain looked at him. Against a submerged submarine? Sir, the new settings, Chief Merrick's calculations, they're designed for exactly this. The captain had read Merrick's report, had attended the briefing where an enlisted man explained how Navy doctrine had been wrong for 18 months. You confident in those settings, Lieutenant? Sir, I'm confident in the chief who calculated them. Sonar, confirm target depth. 200 feet, sir, holding steady. Range 1,800 yards. Weapons free. Fire when ready. Cordell set the torpedoes himself, used Merrick's temperature compensation formula, adjusted depth for water that was 5 degrees instead of 15, set them for impact detonators, not magnetic. Simple mathematics, no elegance, just cold water physics and a chief's willingness to trust measurement over theory. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. 4 torpedoes launched into North Atlantic darkness. 4 weapons running on settings that would have seemed crude to the engineers who designed their predecessors. 4 chances to prove simple could beat sophisticated. 4 torpedoes cut through black water. 4 weapons running calculations no German engineer had ever tested. 4 chances to prove that a chief torpedoman's stubbornness mattered more than laboratory perfection. Cordell's hands were steady on the firing controls, but his mind raced through Merrick's equations. Water temperature, 5 degrees Celsius. Density increase, 0.4%. Pressure differential, 2.8 meters at 4-meter depth. Set the weapon for 1.2 meters. It would run at exactly 4 meters in this cold water. Simple mathematics, the kind that didn't require advanced degrees, just attention to reality. 41 seconds after launch, the first torpedo struck U-156 amidships. The sound traveled through water like God's own hammer. Steel screamed, rivets failed. Pressure hull plating forged in Kiel and assembled by men who believed German engineering was superior to physics itself, simply ceased to exist. The second torpedo hit 8 seconds later, lower, aft of the control room. The explosion vented into the battery compartment, mixing seawater with sulfuric acid, creating chlorine gas that would kill anyone who breathed it. U-156 had no choice, surface or die. "Contact breaking up," the sonar operator called. Hull fractures across multiple sections, target surfacing emergency. The captain brought the Benson around slowly, carefully, because even a dying U-boat could fire a last torpedo if you gave it the angle. Through darkness, Hartmann's conning tower broke surface, already canted 15 degrees to port, water streaming from ruptured tanks. Hatches cracked open. Men climbed out, hands raised, faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from understanding you're alive only because you surrendered before the ocean finished killing you. Cordell stood at the torpedo controls, looking at weapons that had just performed exactly as designed. Not as the engineers who built them had designed them, as Merrick had redesigned them by refusing to accept that laboratory conditions matched combat conditions. "Mr. Cordell," the captain said quietly, "mark this in the log. 4 torpedoes fired, 4 ran true, 2 hits, target disabled, Chief Merrick's settings validated in combat." Cordell wrote it down, knowing that somewhere, maybe Newport, maybe a forward base in the Pacific, Merrick would read this report and understand that mechanics who paid attention mattered more than engineers who assumed. Oil began rising to the surface. Not a small leak, a catastrophic rupture. Hartmann stood on the conning tower bridge, watching his crew abandon ship. 23 men, all alive because American torpedoes had worked well enough to cripple but not detonate the ammunition stores. All alive because he'd given the order to surface before the boat went too deep to escape. He thought about the 6 torpedoes he'd fired an hour earlier, thought about weapons that cost more than most Germans earned in a decade, failing because someone in Eckernförde had tested them in water that bore no resemblance to where they'd be used. The Benson came alongside. American sailors threw lines. Hartmann's crew climbed down, one by one, trading the Atlantic for captivity, trading certain death for uncertain future. Hartmann was last to leave. He looked back at U-156 one final time. The boat was settling by the stern, pressure hull compromised, already starting its final dive. He'd lost his command not to superior tactics or overwhelming force. He'd lost it to a mechanic who'd tested weapons in cold water. August 2nd, 1942. Naval Intelligence Interrogation Facility, Boston. Korvettenkapitän Ernst Hartmann sat in a room painted institutional green, wearing a borrowed American uniform. Across the table sat 2 officers, and one man in navy dress blues with Chief Torpedoman Mate insignia. Silas Merrick. Hartmann recognized the rank. Enlisted man, technical specialist, the kind who kept weapons working while officers decided when to use them. "Captain Hartmann," the senior officer said through a translator, "we'd like to understand what happened during your attack on convoy ONS 113. Hartmann had decided to cooperate. The war wasn't over, but his part was. And he was tired of pretending weapons designed by brilliant men somehow failed because of operator error. "What happened is what always happens," he said in careful English. He'd learned it at university before the war. "Our torpedoes did not work. Yours did." The officers exchanged glances. Merrick watched with the attention that came from 12 years of listening to machinery tell him when something was wrong. "Specifically," Hartmann continued, "I fired 6 torpedoes at a stationary target in perfect conditions. 6 weapons certified by our best engineers. 1 damaged the target. 5 failed completely." "Why do you think they failed?" "I do not think. I know. They run too deep in cold water. The magnetic pistols trigger prematurely or not at all. I have documented this in 17 separate reports over 8 months. Every report was dismissed as operator error." Merrick spoke for the first time, quiet, without judgment. "What water temperature, Capitan?" Hartmann looked at him, recognized something in how the chief asked. Not challenging, confirming. 5 degrees Celsius. "And where were your torpedoes tested?" "The Baltic, Eckernförde facility, test tank conditions." "Water temperature in the test tank?" Hartmann understood where this was going. 15 degrees, maintained constant for optimal testing. Merrick nodded slowly. "Denser water creates higher pressure. Pressure sensor thinks the weapon is shallower than it is, runs deep, misses the target." Not a question, an explanation Hartmann had arrived at himself 6 months earlier, an explanation his engineers had rejected because it contradicted their calculations. "You discovered this," Hartmann said. Not a question either. "Tested it, proved it, changed our torpedo settings to compensate." "And the magnetic pistols?" "Earth's magnetic field varies by latitude. At northern latitudes, the variance triggers the exploder early. Southern latitudes might not trigger at all. We disabled ours, went back to simple contact detonators." Hartmann sat back, looked at the ceiling, laughed without humor. "We were told our weapons were perfect, that any failure was our fault for not using them correctly." "We're told the same thing," Merrick said. "Had to prove them wrong." "How did you prove them wrong?" "Filled a test tank with cold seawater, ran the torpedoes in actual Atlantic conditions instead of laboratory conditions. Watched them fail the same way yours did." The translator was struggling. Hartmann waved him off, speaking directly to Merrick. "You are not an officer." "No, sir, chief torpedoman mate." "A mechanic?" "Yes, sir." "And you contradicted your engineers?" "Had to. They were wrong." Hartmann leaned forward. "Your superiors believed you? An enlisted man telling officers they were mistaken?" Merrick's expression didn't change. "Eventually, after I showed them data they couldn't ignore. In Germany that would end your career. Almost ended mine too, but I had a good officer who cared more about what worked than about who was right. 2 men from opposite sides of a war, both of whom had fought their own institutions before they'd fought each other." "Your torpedoes worked," Hartmann said finally. "All 4 hit my boat. First time in 8 months I've seen torpedoes perform as designed." "They're not sophisticated anymore," Merrick said. "No magnetic exploders, simple contact detonators, depth settings adjusted for cold water. Crude technology, but reliable. Reliability is its own sophistication." Merrick almost smiled. "Trying to explain that to engineers is harder than explaining it to U-boat commanders, I expect." Hartmann extended his hand across the table. Merrick hesitated, then shook it. "Chief Merrick, I have spent 8 months watching my weapons fail, while my superiors told me I was using them incorrectly. You had the courage to prove your superiors wrong. That is worth more than any engineering degree." "Captain, I just tested things the way they'd actually be used. Common sense. Common sense is the rarest form of genius. The numbers told the story headlines never would." June through December 1942. Allied torpedo success rates climbed from 31% to 58%. Not because of new weapons, not because of better tactics, because someone had admitted that sophisticated technology calibrated for laboratory conditions didn't work in the North Atlantic in winter. German torpedo efficiency declined, not catastrophically, just steadily, the way a weapon fails when nobody is willing to question whether it actually works. U-boat patrols expended more torpedoes per sinking, returned with partial successes instead of decisive kills, filed reports that continued to be dismissed until the weight of evidence became too heavy to ignore. In September, Dr. Heinrich Vogel received a direct order from Admiral Dönitz to review all field reports from the previous 12 months, to analyze them without prejudice, to determine whether the weapons were failing or the men firing them were failing. Vogel spent 3 weeks with data that Oskar Brenneis had been collecting since March. Temperature correlations, depth discrepancies, magnetic pistol anomalies. The pattern was undeniable. On September 23rd, Vogel authorized modifications to the G7E torpedo, adjust depth settings for cold water, recalibrate magnetic pistols for latitude variation, changes that would have saved hundreds of ships if they'd been implemented in April. But April was 5 months gone. The Atlantic campaign's momentum had already shifted. Brenneis found Vogel in the test facility that evening. The older man stood alone, watching a torpedo run through its 298th consecutive perfect test in water that still bore no resemblance to the ocean where men were fighting. "Herr Doctor, the modifications are approved." Vogel didn't turn around. "I know. Production will implement them within 6 weeks." "I know." Brenneis hesitated. "Herr Doctor, I showed you the field data in March." "I remember. You said the data was wrong, that field conditions were creating false observations." Vogel finally turned. He looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "I chose to trust equations over reality. I chose to believe controlled conditions were sufficient to predict uncontrolled outcomes. I chose certainty over doubt because doubt felt like weakness." "You are not alone in that choice, Herr Doctor. Every engineer makes it." "And how many sailors died because I made it?" Brenneis had no answer. Vogel looked back at the test tank, at water that was exactly 15 degrees Celsius, at conditions that had never existed in combat. "The Americans figured it out, did you know that?" "I heard rumors." "They tested in cold water, real ocean conditions, discovered the same flaws we did, but they discovered them in April and changed their weapons immediately. We discovered them in September and spent 5 months protecting our certainty." The American who discovered it was an enlisted man, a mechanic. Vogel smiled without humor. Of course he was. He trusted his hands more than he trusted authority. That is not a quality we encourage. December 1945. Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania. Simus Merrick came home on a cold Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the war in the Pacific ended. He'd spent 3.5 years training submarine crews, consulting on weapons modifications, traveling between Pearl Harbor and Brisbane and New London, and dozens of forward bases. He'd been promoted to warrant officer, had been awarded the Navy Cross, in a ceremony he hadn't attended, had accumulated more classified commendations than he could count, and more stories than he would ever tell. The house in Allentown looked exactly as he remembered. Small, clean. His father's workshop in the garage, still smelling of machine oil and metal shavings. His father was 71 now, still worked part-time at the foundry, still kept his tools organized by size and function. They didn't embrace, didn't need to. His father looked at him, nodded once. "You're back." "Yes, sir." "Good. Come help me with this lathe. Bearings sticking." Merrick spent his first afternoon home doing what he'd done before he joined the Navy. Working with metal, fixing things that were broken, using his hands to solve problems that didn't require equations or theories or officers arguing about whose idea was correct. It felt right. That evening his father asked the only question about the war he would ever ask. "Did what you did matter?" Merrick thought about convoy routes kept open, about ships that arrived instead of sinking, about men who went home to families because a torpedo hit instead of running deep. "Yes, sir, I think it did." "Good." They didn't talk about it again. Merrick took a job at Bethlehem Steel, worked as a machinist, taught younger men the same lessons his father had taught him. Measure twice, cut once, trust what you can measure over what someone says you should believe. He married in 1947, had 2 sons, lived a quiet life that looked nothing like heroism and everything like the kind of steady competence that actually held the world together. He never talked about the torpedoes, never mentioned that he'd changed how the Navy fought, never told anyone that an enlisted mechanic from Pennsylvania had proven that reality mattered more than reputation. He kept his logbook in a drawer, looked at it sometimes, remembered the night he'd filled test tanks with cold seawater and proven that perfect on paper didn't mean perfect in practice. 1973. Summer. The Navy declassified the torpedo testing program. 30 years after the fact, the documents became public. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer found Merrick's name in the files, found his address, showed up at his door on a Saturday morning. Merrick was 63, retired from Bethlehem Steel, spent his time in his workshop, teaching his grandson how to use a lathe the same way his father had taught him. "Mr. Merrick, I'm writing about the torpedo testing program during World War II. Your name appears in classified reports as the primary investigator." That was a long time ago. "The reports say you discovered a fundamental flaw in German torpedo design, that you proved American torpedoes had the same flaw, that your work changed the Atlantic campaign." They're calling it the Merrick Standard now, official Navy doctrine. Good. Should have been doctrine all along. "Can I ask you some questions?" They sat in Merrick's workshop, surrounded by tools organized by size and function, by metal stock cut to precise lengths, by a lifetime of work that had nothing to do with recognition. "How did you discover the flaw?" "Watched German torpedoes miss in cold water. Figured cold water might matter. Tested it." But torpedo engineers had tested these weapons for years. They tested them in conditions they could control. I tested them in conditions that actually existed. "Weren't you afraid of contradicting the experts?" Merrick looked at the reporter the way he'd looked at officers who'd told him his observations must be wrong. "Experts know theory. I knew salt water. Sometimes you need both. Usually you just need to pay attention to what's real. The files say thousands of ships survived because of your work. The files say a lot of things. Do you think you changed the war?" Merrick picked up a micrometer from his workbench, adjusted it to exactly 0.5 inches, handed it to the reporter. "What's that measure?" "Half an inch." "How do you know?" "The scale says so." "And if someone with a PhD told you it measured 0.6 inches? I'd check the scale again. "That's your answer? About changing the war?" "That's my answer about everything. Trust what you can measure. Test things the way they'll actually be used. Don't believe something's perfect just because someone says it is." 1987, November. Merrick died quietly in his sleep at age 77. The obituary in the Allentown paper was 4 sentences long. Mentioned his Navy service. Said he'd worked at Bethlehem Steel for 32 years. Listed survivors. Didn't mention torpedoes. Didn't mention that he'd saved thousands of lives by refusing to believe that perfect in a laboratory meant perfect in the ocean. His grandson found the logbook when cleaning out the house. Read through pages of careful observations, temperature measurements, torpedo wake descriptions. Found the entry from March 6, 1942. First torpedo passed beneath target. Found the entry from April 24th. Cold water matters. Nobody believes me yet. Found dozens more entries, tracking failures, documenting patterns, building evidence that would eventually change how weapons were tested. The last entry was from May 18, 1942, just after the ocean trials off Block Island. It said, "Simple works, fancy breaks. Remember this." The grandson kept the logbook. Years later, he would donate it to the Naval History and Heritage Command. The logbook sits in an archive now, in a climate-controlled room at the Washington Navy Yard. Researchers request it occasionally, historians writing about the Atlantic campaign, engineers studying weapon system failures, students trying to understand how wars are won in workshops and test facilities as much as on battlefields. They read Merrick's careful handwriting, his measurements, his observations that nobody wanted to hear because they contradicted what everyone wanted to believe.
Some of them understand, most don't.
Because the real lesson wasn't about torpedoes or temperature or pressure sensors calibrated for the wrong ocean. The real lesson was about the difference between what looks right on paper and what actually works when metal meets salt water, and men's lives depend on whether you tested your assumptions honestly. Merrick never called himself a hero, refused the title every time it was offered.
Because he understood something that officers and engineers and politicians often forgot.
That heroism wasn't about being brave or smart or right. It was about being willing to question whether you were wrong. The German engineers who designed the G7E torpedo were brilliant. Vogel's pressure sensing mechanism was a masterpiece of precision engineering. His magnetic influence pistol was elegant in ways that simple contact detonators could never match.
And it failed because brilliance without honesty produces sophisticated weapons that miss their targets.
Merrick's contribution wasn't intelligence, wasn't education, wasn't even particularly original. Any engineer could have filled a tank with cold seawater and run the test. Could have. Didn't. Because filling a tank with cold water meant admitting that laboratory conditions might not match reality.
And admitting that meant questioning decades of work by people smarter and more educated than a machinist's son from Pennsylvania.
Merrick questioned anyway. That's what saved the ships. Not the adjusted depth settings, not the disabled magnetic exploders. The willingness to trust what he could measure over what authority told him must be true. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, water still runs cold and dense, and exactly 4 degrees Celsius in summer.
Ships still cross those waters carrying cargo and crews and the weight of commerce that keeps nations connected.
None of them know about Silas Merrick. But they cross safely because a chief torpedoman's mate once refused to believe that perfect in a laboratory meant perfect in the ocean. The Atlantic didn't choose a winner. It just rewarded the side that listened.
And Merrick, standing in that midnight test facility with his hands on cold metal and cold water, showing him truth that contradicted everything the experts believed, had listened better than anyone. The ocean spoke. He heard. That was enough.